Greetings, everybody. Thanks for joining us for this session on comparative democratic erosion in Hungary and Brazil. My name is Rachel Epstein. I'm a professor at the Korbel School of International Studies. I'm also a senior associate dean there. And this event is it's co-sponsored by the C Center for International Security and Diplomacy at the Korbel School. And then we have another co-sponsor, which is the Institute for Comparative and Regional Studies, which is wonderful. Thank you for your support given the topic. I also want to say by way of introduction that this is a C-Center initiative on responsible policy engagement. And what we're trying to do at the C-Center with the support of the Carnegie Corporation of New York is to think about how research can be productively applied in the real world. And of course, what we're talking about today is how we might think about remedying democratic erosion in places like Hungary and Brazil. I just want to say then a couple more words about the comparison. So Hungary and Brazil are two very different cases in some ways in very different parts of the world, and yet they do have some features in common. Both countries moved at a certain point from authoritarianism to more democratic rule. And we'll talk about this, but in some sense also the emergence of now autocratic leaders in both countries, Orbán in Hungary, Bolsonaro in Brazil. These were in some ways, our discussants will talk about this more, democratically elected leaders who in some sense portray what they're doing as being the will of the people in both countries. So what we're hoping to do through the comparison is to examine two apparently quite different cases, but see if we can find some common features between them to understand the roots of democratic erosion and how we might address that productively. So for this panel today, I'm very fortunate to be joined by two excellent faculty from different institutions who are not only area experts in Eastern Europe and Latin America, respectively, but who also hail from the countries that we're talking about. So they can give us both an academic perspective as well as a personal perspective. So I'd first like to introduce you to Professor Dóra Piroska, who is a professor at the Central European University, currently located in Vienna, Austria. She is, broadly speaking, an expert in political economy in East Central Europe, focusing specifically on the post-socialist economies in that region. She's published very widely in political economy and as a particular expert in finance and banking. So I welcome Dóra from the Central European University. It's 8 hours ahead for her where she is. We're really grateful for your participation. I also want to introduce you to Rafael Ioris, who is a regular figure at Korbel events. He's affiliated with our college. He's also affiliated with the Institute for Comparative and Regional Studies. He is a professor in the Department of History at the University of Denver and is a particular expert on Latin American relations, particularly in the Cold War. But I've also heard him speak many times on Brazil and the Brazilian political context in the current period. We're very fortunate to have him not only to give us the Brazilian and Latin American perspective, but he's also going to provide an historical perspective on the questions that we're posing today. So by way of starting, I have a question that is both for Dóra and for Rafael, and they'll answer with respect to their countries of interest. But the first question has to do with the fact, as I mentioned a minute ago, that Prime Minister Orbán and Bolsonaro in Brazil, they were legally and democratically elected leaders. So the first question is, are majorities of publics in these countries satisfied with these leaders and the results that they've delivered? With respect to democratic erosion, I think it would be helpful for me, helpful for our audience, to understand also in this first question, as you answer it in a bit more depth, what democratic erosion has looked like in each of these countries and how citizens, normal citizens living in Hungary and Brazil experience that democratic erosion. So Dóra, I'm going to turn it first to you so you can give us an overview of the Hungarian situation and then turn it over to Rafael for the Brazilian comparison. Welcome, Dóra.
Okay, thank you, Rachel, for having me here. And welcome to the audience. We have quite a few people listening to us. So yes, democratic backsliding is going on in Hungary, but I would like to draw attention here of how we understand what is really democratic backsliding. So in the literature, you usually find a definition given, for example, by Sitter and Bake, that this is a process of deliberate and intended actions on the part of a democratically elected government designed to gradually undermine the fundamental rules of the game in an existing democracy, right? So that's kind of the regular understanding of democratic backsliding. And I have two problems with this definition, quite frankly. So understood the democratic backsliding understood in terms of institutional rules and organizational structures, I think prevents analysts to look at the political economic developments, mass elite relations, and the social context within which the institutional changes are embedded. And this is problematic because it prevents seeing first the way in which economic reforms co-constitute and further strengthen the political rule of the backsliding government. Second, it prevents democratic backsliding as this institutional focus presents democratic backsliding as an uncontested process, and that's why it prevents us from seeing resistance and contestation to it. The Hungarian society not only witnessed increasing government control of every aspect of social life, but also show resistance and contest to the authoritarian tendencies. So both of these blind spots of democratic backsliding analysis precludes potential entry points of counter-movement from the analysis. So let me make these points a bit more in detail. So obviously in Hungary, since 2010, we've seen a wholesale transformation of politics, which entailed a systematic undermining of checks and balances through legislation and frequent constitutional amendments. Just to highlight a few key institutional changes, there's adoption of a new and very controversial constitution, new media law, including the politicization of media oversight authority, a heavy-hitting reform of the justice system, which in the end diminished the independence of the judiciary, a major reform of the electoral system, going way beyond gerrymandering to strengthen the electoral system's majoritarian character, favoring the ruling party and weakening the fragmented opposition. There is an institutional and content-wise reform of secondary and higher education. There are selective changes to the governance of religious establishments, increased dependency of local governments, and I can just go on and on. And most important to my own personal experience, obviously there is a major hit on academic freedom, compelling the CEU to leave Hungary, the Hungarian Academy of Sciences to give up independent resource allocation power, and also the most recent reorganization of public higher education institutions, universities, into private foundations, which are filled with loyalists of Orbán. The corona pandemic wasn't very helpful. It actually gave just more tools and power to the Orbán government to tighten its grip over the Hungarian society. But I would like to also add that all these legal and institutional changes are also embedded into a larger political economic transformation driven by the also Orbán government's new nationalist neoliberal economics policy mix, which strengthened his authoritarian rule. Just to see it, the Orbán economic policy mix enriched its electoral base, the middle class. It also legitimated its authoritarian rule through a financial and economic nationalist economic policy, which targeted multinationals, foreign banks, and foreign utility providers, and preferred national insiders, especially small and medium-sized institutions. Its economic policy mix measures also disempowered the poor, the less educated, through a series of liberalization of the labor market. Liberal labor market rules thus favor the multinationals, especially German car makers, but also weakens domestic opposition and creates, at the same time, through strengthening German ties of Orbán, its political supports at the European Union level, especially in the form of Angela Merkel. And finally, through corruption, Orbán empowers dependent business elite not only to take over strategic sectors, but also to sustain and finance its authoritarian politics. And then we also see, I mean, against all of this backsliding resistance in Hungary. And you, Rachel, asked how we, citizens experience this. And this, I think, really hits hard whenever a certain policy targets the area in which one works, right? So for me, obviously, the most radical changes came with the backsliding when Orbán started to attack the CEU and the existence of the CEU. And it was really hard in terms of, it was an existential threat to my family. And I have 3 children, and the little one especially took it really badly and started to draw what he called blood factory. That was really horrible. At that time, we took him to psychologists, and we started to work on it, that it's not only about, grinning everything down on that factory, and we can live, but not in that country. So I wanted to talk about resistance, and there is hope. There is an increasingly activist opposition government, and which organized recently a successful pre-election campaign. There is a less understanding German government, and then increasingly hostile EU leadership. And there's also a catastrophic management of this pandemic, which all gives, a terrible cost, but hope for change.
Thank you, Dóra. And you and I have also talked about the propaganda that is published, promulgated on visible display in cities like Budapest. And so you gave us a very long list of ways in which really everybody in society would experience the democratic erosion. And as we go forward in this conversation, I'll also ask you about some of those external actors that you mentioned in terms of what influence they have. I should also remind the audience that you can enter your questions through the Q&A, and in the later part of the conversation, we'll be taking your questions, not just my questions, although I have many questions. So Rafael, I'm going to turn it over to you and ask you the same question about how Bolsonaro has done in Brazil, how majorities perceive his rule. And I should point out also in Hungary and Brazil later this year, we're going to see elections in both countries. So we're going to see in part a reaction to these people's leadership. But Rafael, go ahead and give us the overview in Brazil.
Sure. Thank you so much, Rachel. It's always a pleasure to be part of activities held by the Korbel School. And it's a pleasure here to share the panel with Dóra as well. So there's a lot to say here. I want to highlight that I entirely agree with Dóra's warranted point to bring a little bit more of a political economy perspective there. I do think the case of Brazil and Hungary, as well as elsewhere, are expressions of a crisis of liberal democracy, as well as a crisis of neoliberal capitalism. Right? So that variable has to always be brought into the picture. So there are many similarities. I think there's institutional erosion as well in Brazil. There's erosion of social welfare programs that were put in place in the last several years in Brazil, and as well as resistance. And I want to sort of come back to some of these things as I provide a bigger picture of things here. I would say perhaps there's one important difference that is as much of what is happening, what is behind the arrival of Bolsonaro to power is a counterpoint to actual expansion of inclusion, political and economic inclusion in Brazil that was unfolding in the last 30 years, in the last specifically 20 years. So in order to do that, I wanted to kind of highlight a few things. So just briefly to give a short answer to the question, Rachel, I think Bolsonaro now has lost popularity that he had that brought him to the election in 2018. COVID was a turning point in that, and the mismanagement of COVID was a turning point, though he still sustained strong support with core sectors in society. So, but how do we make sense of Bolsonaro arrival to power? As I said briefly, right, we need to remember that Brazil in the last couple decades, 3 decades, transitioned from a long dictatorship of over 20 years, a conservative right-wing dictatorship aligned with the United States in the Cold War and those kind of general points, And the country witnessed from the 1990s economic stabilization, and then sort of the two main parties in the country, they shared a sort of a social democratic outlook. They have differences, they competed for power, but they shared that overlook. And so in the last 30 years, Brazil experienced significant levels of political inclusion. Social movements were an unprecedented level of empowerment, as well as formal liberal democratic institutions were put in place, as well as economic inclusion, especially in the early 2000s, when about 30 million Brazilians rose from poverty to sort of low middle class status. Of course, that has to be taken to the Brazilian context, right? It doesn't mean to be middle class as it would mean in other countries, such as in the US. But at the same time, that transition was controlled by the military in power from 64 to 85. So the transition wasn't a full transition in the sense that democracy was fully consolidated in the country. Also, the old guard, not just in the military, but in the civilian political old guard, the clientelistic style of politics in Brazil were also a defining moment of this liberal democracy that was put in place in the last 30 years, right? There's a new constitution in 1988, and from that on, Brazil has lived in a liberal democratic experience, but again, curbed by those elements that I highlighted. The economic boom of the early 2000s comes to a halt in 2012, when a lot of people took to the streets with many, warranted, demands, but quickly those demonstrations were we use a little strong expression here, but hijacked by conservative elites who really gathered and found an opening to really go against, the Labor Party, which was in power in Brazil and was behind an expansion of welfare programs and behind that sort of economic betterment of Brazilians in the last, 10, 12 years. And then conservatives really come to power, conservatives in the military and in the civilian society, large business groups, ideologically conservatives like evangelical groups in the country, upper middle classes, against a little bit of that notion of larger political and economic inclusion, really found a way to come after the government in power. That was already in 2015, 16. There's a parliamentarian coup, sort of an illegitimate impeachment put together that brings down the president at the time, a woman in Brazil, Dilma Rousseff. And in that situation, I would say formally the Brazilian democracy, because an unwarranted, right, an unjustified impeachment that was put in place, the limits of democratic rule already was weakening. So the country was being the democratic institutions were being tested. And the culmination of that process is under the slogan of anti-corruption, which did exist during the Labor Party rule, but an investigation that was largely politically driven and biased, largely against the left, right? But under the slogan of anti-corruption, it really questioned the functioning of democratic institution at that time, and was able to really give an opening and really to create a glue along several different conservative forces on the banner that politics as usual didn't work anymore. And so the anti-political rhetoric and logic really comes to fore in a very strong sense. And the culmination of that process, of course, is the coming of power of an aberrant figure, which is Bolsonaro, right? In 2018, and that experience, I think it really was the culmination of the anti-politics rhetoric, the questioning of the liberal democratic institutions in the country. Again, there are a lot of problems there, and so the questioning was to some extent warranted, but not a full sort of question in the sense that what we really need is the end of it, right? We would really need is an outsider to come to power and fix everything. We heard that before elsewhere as well, right? And of course, that was also an expression of a consolidation of conservative civilian and political and military forces in the country. So who's Bolsonaro, right? A former military man that presented itself as an outsider, but not really an outsider, was over 20 years a member of the Congress in Brazil, but an extreme right-wing figure that questioned, all the elements of what was happening in the country from the 90s to the early 2000s, arguing that we should go back to a formal dictatorship in the 70s, in the 60s, right, in the early 80s, and really kind of presenting that image that the dictatorship was what really was a height of the good, the country, that we should go back and revert back to that logic. Key supporters he found within the military. Military is in unprecedented levels in power in Brazil today. Even in moments during the dictatorship, we did not have as many officers in cabinet positions, in governmental agencies as they are in power in today, Brazil. Very conservative ideological forces, especially among not only, but especially along Pentecostal churches that really provide the glue for sort of lower, socioeconomic groups in the country. The traditional middle classes, upper middle classes, especially in the business community, and particularly insofar as the agribusiness export sector of commodities in the country, right? So they provided the key sort of support for the question of the Labour Party programs, but also specifically to the rise of Bolsonaro. And again, all of that coalesced along the argument of anti-politics rhetoric and logic, and now an outsider needs to come and change everything. Now, in power in the last 3 years, Bolsonaro has worked within the political system, but trying to test it recurrently. Right, at different times, he always made the case that what we needed was to close the system, that only a more overtly authoritarian regime would fix the problems of the country, and he was able to maintain his core supporters, but increasingly, and again, because of COVID and the mismanagement of COVID, there was stronger resistance coming first from the judiciary, the Supreme Court and all local courts, local governors in the different states in Brazil, and eventually even in largely ruled by conservative forces, many of which support Bolsonaro, but still in Congress. So because this mismanagement was so huge that even Congress had to come in and step in and provide some sort of resistance to his more overt authoritarian arguments and denying that COVID was real, and what we really need was, a full-fledged military government that would take care of things top down. So he has faced resistance from institutions, as well as, of course, resistance in the streets, which was actually rising prior to COVID. When COVID comes, of course, that was halted. But still, the numbers of supporters really diminished. I was in Brazil up to a week ago, during the holidays, and talking to people that openly said that they supported Bolsonaro before, but now they're not willing to support again. He's likely to run, no one really knows, but he's likely to run for re-election in October this year. So the situation is in a sense that again, Bolsonaro faced resistance. The old guard, conservative forces in Congress and largely conservative judiciary, nonetheless, was able to stop the more overt authoritarian moves, but provided in that sense some institutional resistance, as well as the lowering figure and the numbers of support that he still faced. So he still has support in core groups. I would say then that the case of Bolsonaro, just to conclude, it expresses an institutional crisis of Brazilian democracy for sure, though the system hasn't sort of collapsed, right? There is resistance in key institutions. Formally, we still, are to have an election we had held mayoral elections a couple of years ago. And then, of course, we are due to have a presidential in Congress, parliamentary election in October. And we still have, media free, somewhat free, though there is some, questioning of science community, of academic communities and opposition in a very overt way. The key question now, of course, for the election is what the armed forces, which were supportive of Bolsonaro's candidacy in 2018, are enjoying themselves in government now with unprecedented levels of positions and pay, extra pay for serving in government, and still with the key voices in the armed forces ideologically aligned with Bolsonaro's position. Of course, it's unclear to see the extent of that support, but the key question is what the armed force will do if the election is really, held in October in a free and fair way.
Good, thank you, Rafael. I have a kind of follow-up question from your remarks for both panelists, which is that I think people in publics who have sometimes opposed people in power, and I include in the United States, we tend to blame the leader for democratic erosion and autocratization. My question, though, for both of you, because both Hungary and Brazil, the change in power was preceded by scandal, and I understand what you're saying, Rafael. Was it a real scandal? Was it a manufactured scandal? But also the socialists in Hungary, came under very heavy criticism. So here's my question. In both of these cases, aside from blaming Orbán and his coalition, Bolsonaro and his coalition, what do the oppositionists have to answer for in the rise to power of these people? Dóra, do you want to answer that question vis-a-vis Fidesz and Orbán?
So opposition, you mean political parties in opposition?
Yeah, because in Hungary, I'm under the impression that they're not very well organized. They haven't been very effective. There's a reluctance, but correct me if I'm wrong, to come together and really launch an effective opposition to Orbán, but maybe Orbán's takeover of institutions has been too overwhelming for them to be effective.
Can you enable me to share my screen?
Yeah. Oh, yes.
So, these public opinion polls and approval of Orbán and opposition, that is just answering quickly this question.
Sorry. Why don't you go ahead and you can begin answering the question while I set it up to
No,
share.
I think it works now.
Okay, good.
Let me just, it wasn't this. Just don't see my slides. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
It's just that, yeah, I know. Where is this? Yeah, here we go. So can you see this?
Yes. Scatter plot. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so the orange is Fidesz's color, and then I stop my video. Here we go. This is opinion polls about the approval of Orbán, very recent, January 2021, and the United for Hungary, right? The United Opposition, right? I think they're doing a pretty good job in terms of with expectations, you know, if they will be able to elect them, get elected. But, and again, I have to play a little bit here with this. If we look at this chart with regards to the opposition parties individually and their popularity compared to Fidesz, which is the orange lines, we see a major difference, right? So Fidesz's popularity is way beyond the opposition party's popularity. So this is again recent figures from 2018 until 2021. The red is the Socialist Party, which is constantly losing popularity, but the Gyurcsány-led Democratic Coalition, which is also supposedly a socialist leaning party, is actually gaining popularity. So there is some changes here. I'm going to stop sharing. So yes, the opposition is divided, but shouldn't it be, right? We used to have an electoral system which quite nicely reflected, you know, plurality of the Hungarian society. So in a way, this blaming of the opposition of being, you know, pluralistic, of standing for very different values, I think that blaming them for standing for the Hungarian society, right? This is the Hungarian society. It's divided along multiple lines, and in a way, it's the majoritarian electoral system that Orbán forced on us, which is going to prevent them from actually representing the plurality of the Hungarian society.
Good, thank you. Rafael, what do you think about in Brazil? Does the do Lula and Rousseff have anything to answer for? Are they really victims in this scenario?
Well, I think politicians always have to answer. Let's to begin with that. But sure. So again, we need to remember, if you know, to just kind of, you know, everybody is on the same page, right? That much of that resistance and the way that the path that, you know, led to the coming down from power of the Labour Party was mired and was led, right, by what's called the car wash operation, right, which is this very broad investigation led by the, you know, different sectors of public ministry and the federal police in Brazil, you know, uncovering major scandals involving largely the oil corporation, federally control in Brazil, and also, you know, construction corporations, Brazilian, but also operating abroad. So the point is, of course, there was corruption, and of course the Labour Party has to answer for that. Ironically, though, there are two things here, right? Much of the investigations were made possible by institutional improvements that were created under the Labour Party rule. The Labour Party provided now more accountability, created more investigative transparency, gave more autonomy to the federal police, gave more resources to the public ministry. So a lot of what the Labour Party institutional reforms provided the means for those investigations to take place. That's one thing to remember, just kind of on the ironic side of things. More seriously, or more concerning perhaps, would be the fact that the car wash operation now, it's very, very clear, right? In the news, but also in the judiciary. The Supreme Court in Brazil itself has declared, right, was largely politically oriented, politically driven, and extremely biased, right? Not only, but largely investigated people, you know, in the Labour Party and close people associated with them, and not clearly investigating, you know, more broadly the political system. There are politicians of other parties that have been prosecuted as well, but not to the same degree. And more so politically, you know, the information provided by car wash was used politically, including by members in the judiciary, not by the only Sérgio Moro, the federal judge, right, that was behind sort of the incrimination of Lula and leading to his arrest. But not only the arrest and charges that led to the fact that he was removed from, being the candidate that would likely have stopped Bolsonaro's election, because he was running ahead of Bolsonaro in 2018, but he was not allowed to run. Now, if everything stays as it looks today, right, in October 2018, we're going to have the replay of that election when Lula was removed. And by now, it's very clear to some extent, one could make the case, illegally removed, because he still had political rights, but things sort of led to this perfect storm, right? That led to a media support and this anti-corruption argument, anti-politics argument, right? That the old guard all had to be removed and the new guy would have to come in and clean everything, created a situation where even the Supreme Court was pressure, right, to confirm the fact that Lula's arrest was legal, even though now they revisit that decision and they said, well, no, the investigation was biased and it was largely, they had therefore a mistake, right? That Lula was not, very serious mistake, was not allowed to run in 2018. So now in October 2022, likely, right, Bolsonaro will face Lula. And the current polls is about 50 against 30 on the second round, right? You have to make the second round to actually win if you don't get 50 plus one vote in the first round. Lula perhaps could even win in the first round. The point is, yes, though I started by saying that Labour Party politicians, including Lula himself, have to answer to a lot of things. The fact is, most Brazilians think that he is okay enough that he would be voted back to power, right? And if the election is held as they are today and they are fair and confirmed, Lula is likely to beat Bolsonaro and come to power in early next year. To be seen.
Good, thank you. I want to ask you both something else along exactly those lines, given that we are looking at a situation with Hungary and Brazil, both will have elections. I want to ask you about the information and media environment in both countries, because this is a huge concern in the United States, but also around the world. It's also a specific interest of mine. When people go to the polls, based on the media they have available to them, how well informed are they? There may be the issue of them experiencing changes in rights, democratic erosion, increased economic benefits or decreased economic benefits, depending on the regime in power. But I am curious, how well are the media outlets doing in Hungary and Brazil to unveil the deeper problems that might exist? And you both referred to problems of corruption in both of these regimes. How well aware are people of those? How ably has media been able to function in these autocratizing environments? Dóra, I'll start with you.
Thank you. It's a very interesting question. I only have segments of the answer, no expert on this one here, but I would start with that you ask about incomplete information of voters, right? And clearly in Hungary, we don't talk about incomplete information. It's misinformation, which is kind of the primary information of most citizens. And the reason for that is really, again, has to do with a lot of advancement of the Orbán government. So one of them is that we do have a propaganda ministry, right? So we do have a minister responsible for the government's communication, just like God does, exactly the same. We don't have a Ministry of Healthcare or a Ministry of Labor separately dedicated to these issues, but we do have a Ministry of the Prime Minister's office, it's called, which is the propaganda ministry. Fidesz is extremely active on Facebook, very spends a lot of money. It's also a bit controversial because it's mainly taxpayers' money that they spend, not necessarily party funding. It actively promotes campaigns on Facebook, and it also has something that Putin also has, this troll army, dedicated Fidesz voters who Orbán can mobilize, or the propaganda ministry can actually mobilize them by sending directed information to them to post on Facebook on certain issues and attack certain topics, persons, whatever. There's of course the complete control of public media, right? We do have something which is called public media. It's not necessarily the case in the US. It's a bit like it used to be, or the idea sometimes was that it should be something like the BBC. It's not. It's the most important tool in the hand of the propaganda ministry. It's extremely well funded. and it creates the most substantial lies and misinformation about the Orbán performance. We also have a complete control of the regional media outlets, right? And the municipality left was, and this is something I again want to show you just very briefly if I find it, because I think it really looks scary a little bit. Here we go. Do you see these are different? You can see the names. These are different online newspapers projecting exactly the same news exactly at the same time. So that's a complete control, I'd say. And then there is also the billboard campaign, right? Which we talk about, you know, the visuals on the streets that again upsets me and upset my children and also coming back to the control of the media, there is also another important thing about corruption, is that there is a complete control over advertisement spending of major Hungarian firms who are, you know, connected to Orbán, most of them, but also interestingly, foreign multinationals don't dare or don't want to anymore advertise in non-Orbán related media outlets. So their financial resources are really very, very small. And, you know, in the end, we have hate speech, lies, and misinformation dominating the media.
Yeah, I'm aware that the information transformation over the last 12 years in Hungary has been very extensive. I don't know what the state of affairs is in Brazil, so I'm very curious, Rafael, to hear your view on how well informed publics are in Brazil about what's really going on.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well informed, right? I agree with Dóra in the sense that it would be nice if it was just kind of misinformed, right? It's to some extent entirely, you know, in a different parallel universe to some extent, right? So there's no a formal ministry of propaganda, I would call, in Brazil today. Largely media is in very strong family held, you know, very powerful family groups, you know, media conglomerates, very powerful, very influential. And by the way, many of which led, right, the sort of the, you know, took over the whole car wash, you know, information and really acted very forcefully to you know, against Lula and to bring down the Labour Party. So media had played a major role in creating this perfect storm, right? That helped erode institutional formal democracy in Brazil to some extent, at least, and bring to power Bolsonaro, right? Interestingly, Bolsonaro, who comes to power himself to some extent with some sort of not formal support by some of those media conglomerates, but by the environment, right? That the campaign against the Labour Party created by media conglomerates created, right? That environment. Bolsonaro emerges in that situation of anti-politics, anti-corruption, but he had his own media. I would call them digital militia, right? And they really were very active and extremely successful in providing the misinformation, the fake news, right? That helped his election in 2018, and now in power with public funds, not in a formal ministry of propaganda, but through public funds to their own digital militias, largely to WhatsApp. And WhatsApp played a major role. I guess in the United States with Trump was more, I guess, Facebook or Twitter. In Brazil was WhatsApp, right? By creating hundreds, right, of different dozens a day, right, different targeted, you know, misinformation, accusations against the Labour Party, against Lula, and it was very hard to talk to people to say, where did you get this information? This is an absurd, you know, this is a lie that the Labour Party would, if the guy who replaced Lula in the ticket when he was arrested in the mid-year 2018, which has not died, a former minister of education, an intellectual and academic, that he would kidnap children, right, from the families' houses and take them to summer camps where they would be forced to change sex. I mean, that was kind of the information that was spread through WhatsApp in millions, right, a day, to the point that WhatsApp in Brazil passed a new rule where you cannot share more than 5 different numbers at a time. Because before you could share to hundreds of numbers, right? Now you can only do 5, and then you have to do it again, which takes a little more work. But, you know, we have all this number of people paid now by the government, you know, with mismanagement of public funds. And there's investigation in courts, right, about that, because the government's funds should not be used to provide support for the digital militia, is still praising Bolsonaro and still accusing Lula and the Labour Party and so forth, and all the opposition. So there's some investigation there, which means the digital militias of Bolsonaro are weakened, right? They are weaker now than in 2018, but they're still there. And there's a growing sense that they're going to become even more active now as the election comes closer in October. So that's the situation. Just one final thing also, I think is important to highlight, similar to Hungary and elsewhere, right? This anti-science, anti-knowledge, anti-academic, anti-scientific, agencies and community has been very strong, an important element of the Bolsonaro government. And some people had to go into exile. I mean, so there's some friends of mine, academics, that are actually based in European countries, because otherwise they would, they felt threatened enough by, again, not by a public ministry or a member of the government formally, but by this digital militia, people going after them, online and sometimes even, physically. So that's part of the whole authoritarian, logic at work in Brazil today.
Thank you. So I just have one more question for both of you, and we do have some questions in the chat, but I want to get this last one in. If you could be brief in your answer, that'll give us time to get to the questions from the audience. But the last question is really about, what can external actors do anything to assist, prevent, or halt democratic erosion? I think for Hungary in particular, as a member of the EU ostensibly is very committed to democratic principles, rule of law, freedom of speech, freedom of media, etc. What can the EU do? Why hasn't the EU already done more? Rafael, in your case, given the proximity of Brazil and the United States, one question would be, do developments in the United States have an effect on democratic quality in Brazil? Is there any kind of demonstration effect, or does it get easier for Bolsonaro to do what he does if we have a more authoritarian leaning leader? Does it become harder when that person goes away? What is the relationship between the international system and democratic erosion, or stopping democratic erosion in these countries? Dóra, I'll start with you.
Thanks, Rachel. So this is a game that there are many different kinds of connections between the Hungarian democratic backsliding and the EU. And just to highlight a few. So obviously the EU to some extent is financing Orbán's economic policies through the cohesion funds and the structural funds, which are directly transferred to the Orbán government, and they allocated according to political preferences and their corrupt purposes. So that's one thing. In another lane, the EU's, especially the post-2008 reforms, strengthened some of the, let's say, neoliberal authoritarian character of EU. Not entirely, and I wouldn't say it's an entire grip, but definitely strengthen the executive institutions within the EU and within member states as well. Strengthening the executive as opposed to civil actors, the trade unions or other institutions which can control the executive, is problematic. And this is, I would say, another impact of the EU on Hungary, strengthening democratic backsliding. Orbán is constantly attacking the EU and accusing Brussels with different kinds of intervention that he has to defend the nation from it, and is nurturing and spreading all kinds of lies about how George Soros and the bureaucrats in Brussels conspire against him and the Hungarian people, which are the same thing. And so there's a very, very aggressive anti-EU rhetoric also in Hungary. Very interestingly, opinion polls year after year throughout Orbán shows that the two most enthusiastic population inside the European Union for the EU are the Hungarians and the Poles. So there is this very interesting contradiction how this Hungarian population at the same time endorses Orbán. And so the EU can obviously do a lot of things against the democratic backsliding, but it doesn't, right? In many instances, I'm studying banking and finance, the independence of the Hungarian Central Bank was gone at the moment in 2013, the new governor was announced. The ECB didn't blink an eye, right? It didn't raise any concern. It was tremendous amount of funding channeled to cronies through the central bank foundations. The ECB has the legal capacity to control it, and it didn't. it claimed no, no interference, no interest, no right. Why should I bother? The von der Leyen Commission is the first commission which is a little bit more activist in this regard, and it's also supported by, I guess, political changes in Germany. So the Angela Merkel has been, and rightly so, praised for a lot of her foreign policy moves. Endorsing Orbán, I don't think is one that we should be grateful to her. With the changes now in the German political system, we might have hope. So the EU could do a lot more, and that's my argument very shortly, and it doesn't. And as such, it actually strengthens democratic backsliding.
Interesting. Thanks, Dóra. Rafael, how does it look from Brazil? Are there external actors that affect Brazilian democracy and its quality?
Sure. So we don't have a European Union to come to the aid, and apparently they're not doing as a good job as they could, as Dóra said. I guess the main official actor, governmental actor, of course, is the government of the United States, right? Which has had a major role in Latin American politics, historically. So just kind of situate, right? Yes, Trump was elected in 2016 and Bolsonaro 2018, and during his campaign, a little bit of the appeal that he savvily, kind of portrayed was, and especially even after the election, came to a point when he was called the Trump of the tropics, right? So Trump provided a little bit the legitimacy for that kind of style, political rhetoric, political style, some of the ideas. The attack on the international community a little more broadly, because of course couldn't attack the specific organizations such as the European community, but he attacked Mercosur, which is a much weaker, right, local market in South America than the European Union is, but he attacked that. He attacked diffusely the global community, as sort of a conspiracy against Brazil led by cultural Marxism. I'm still trying to understand what that is, but right, this diffuse notion that there's a leftist conspiracy against, the real nation of Brazil. So again, there's recurrent themes of authoritarian neo-fascist leaders. So there was a lot of expectation that Biden, right, would change tone. And I think he did change tone somewhat, right? But no major changes, are yet to be seen, right? I am a member actually of a network of academics here in the United States. It's called the U.S. Network for Defense of Democracy in Brazil, largely led by academics, Brazilianists and others in the United States. And we try to make the case in the media, write op-eds and discuss our best ways to bring knowledge, right, to the international community at large, also in the United States public community and political leaders, right, to guarantee a fair election. Like this year will be our main goal, right, to make the case that the election of Brazil has to be held freely and democratically and fairly, and that the results need to be accepted by the candidates, right? So that's our main goal for this year. The point is, right, there's some civil society organizations that can and are trying to make a difference. But in the terms of the Biden administration, though, there's a little bit of change of tone, vis-a-vis Latin America, no major changes have come. On the contrary, right? In the first few months already of Biden's government, both ambassadors met and high-level rankings and members said they would work with Bolsonaro government for the sake of U.S. good Brazil relations, economic relations primarily. So we are to be seen if the United States government can play this role that we would like to see, which is defend a fair election.
Mm-hmm. Good. Thank you, Rafael. So I have several questions in the chat, all of which are very nicely comparative. The first one I'm going to ask is from Tori Wyman, who's a wonderful student at Korbel. She's asking specifically about the Prime Minister Orbán and his political party Fidesz's takeover of the higher education system. And, she's asking, to what extent does this takeover of higher education train people in a particular way that they go out onto the world stage, into international diplomacy, into the EU, with this more nationalistic worldview and socialization? Is that an effect that you're seeing, Dóra? And then on the Brazilian side, is the Brazilian political system set up in such a way that Bolsonaro or other leaders like him could similarly exploit higher education for the purposes of propagating a more nationalistic view coming politically from Brazil than is currently the case? So I'll start with you, Dóra. And then Rafael, if you could tell us what the situation is vis-a-vis higher education in Brazil, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, thanks. So indeed, there is an attempt of takeover of higher education, both in terms of controlling and censoring it, and also in the sense of how the question is formed in kind of this intent of educating a new conservative elite. And we do see impacts of it in a sense that if you look more closely at Orbán circles and Orbán governments, we do see, public figures around Orbán were at least 10, 15 years younger than Orbán. So been educated, in a system that kind of, or grew up into this public figure under Orbán, not necessarily through the education system, but nevertheless, who speak several languages, very, as we say in Hungary, European conform, kind of European character, and still nevertheless supports Orbán and accepts everything that Orbán says. So obviously, as this system is going to last longer, we will see more of these kind of figures who are coming out of the education system that then Orbán himself created, because they are just not yet. So I agree with the person who asked this question, is that indeed we will see more of these kind of figures. Of course, one key feature of these public figures is their loyalty, right? It's not their critical thought, it's not their independent ideas, it's their absolute and complete loyalty to Orbán and their capacity to double think, to kind of argue or accept everything what Orbán says, no matter whether it's true or not, no matter it's logical or not, kind of still repeat.
Mm-hmm. Good, thank you, Dóra. Rafael, what about in Brazil?
Interestingly, the academics in Brazil have provided one of the main, not the only one, but one important in sort of obstacle, right, to Bolsonaro's moves. The academic environment in Brazil, it's very large. There are dozens and dozens of federally funded universities. The best universities in Brazil really rely on federal funds. And that's one way, of course, that Bolsonaro has been trying to control those funds and to reduce those funds. And he has been able to do that to some extent. But still, there are some constitutionally mandated funds, through distribution of funds that have to go through. So these universities have suffered significantly under Bolsonaro, not just in terms of pay, but in terms of money for research and just kind of running the schools. And that sort of strengthened even more the opposition from academics, of course, against Bolsonaro. Even though I think perhaps different from the case of Hungary, he never had a lot of support among academics. It was very small. He actually had a hard time finding minister of education who tend to be academics themselves, and found these bizarre figures, in some private, small, irrelevant universities to serve as ministers of education, because he could not find some sort of important, respectable intellectual to serve as Minister of Education, which is an important ministry in Brazil that, runs largely the university system and so forth. So academics have provided a significant obstacle against Bolsonaro, but it also have suffered. And again, that has created the situation where they continue to try to act against, to stop his moves. Beyond that, I think he and his few advisors and supporters never had a real plan to how to take over the university or the academic community, or the intellectual community, right? They went on this kind of digital militia argument, right? That we need to attack them and to create a parallel, set of ideas and channels to flow them, not through the institutional ways. So they haven't really sought to, like perhaps we think of the United States, attempt to change textbooks, right? Or city or this district level councils for board, right? School boards, which don't exist in Brazil, but he could try to have undermined by, putting people in key places to change that. That was not really well planned, and they never really were very successful in that. So they continue to kind of have a different line of ideas that they try to spread to their own core supporters through other means, other channels. And in the big scheme of things, I think that's good, right? There was an attempt, and it wasn't successful, the little that was attempted. So academic played an important role in that, and still are playing.
Good. Thank you. So we have just 3 minutes left, so I'm going to ask you to keep your answers to this brief, but I'm going to combine two of the questions. So the answer that you both just gave about your respective countries of expertise kind of feed into this question. One person, Anna-Toni, who is, he says from Berlin, I guess it's a woman. She's from Brazil, and she's wondering, It looks like Brazilian autocratization has not gone nearly as far as Hungarian. So she's wondering, what can we do to make sure that Brazil stays on a relatively more democratic path? So Rafael, I think I'll start with you to answer that. And then we have another question. I'm just wondering, if you could attach political concepts to these leaders, Orbán and Bolsonaro, are they just autocrats? Is either leaning toward more of fascistic orientation? What political label would you give these leaders? Rafael, I'll start with you.
Sure. I'll try to be very brief. I think I would say the main instrument to prevent Brazil from sliding even further into democratic erosion and to starting a process of rebuilding democratic institutions is to have a fair election this year. That is the sine qua non that has to be guaranteed by Brazilian political class and economic forces and civil society and powers that be, as well as the international community. That's it. So I'll just highlight that. In terms of labels, of course, in Brazil, people like myself try to make sense of this in a conceptual sense as well. There's a debate. So I understand that populist and populism, right, has been thrown around a lot of times to talk about these leaders, including Trump, right, in the United States. And so in a populist, perhaps, it could be applied there, but to be a little more narrow in a conceptual sense, right? If you really think more narrowly in terms of the history of populism in the Latin American context, classic populism, which would happen in the mid-20th century, right? That populist, even though it had establishment rhetoric and a little bit direct connection to the people, it was in the historical classical experience of mid-century in key countries in Latin America, including Brazil, right? It was a little more a kind of a reformist attempt, right, to provide, by changing institutions from direct support from the people, to provide reforms, not supporting necessarily all those reforms, but in the sense of some other ways to provide, especially socioeconomic inclusion, if not ideally political inclusion as well. That's not really what Bolsonaro is trying to do, right? So in that sense, I think, a lot of people have called Bolsonaro populist, neo-populist, the populist of the right. I think it's more a case of neo-fascist. I actually have tried to write about this in the sense that he has more overt authoritarian drives and ideas and desires, especially tied to the military. And though he has this sort of appeal to the people, it's not exactly the same thing as going back to the historical case of populism in Latin America. And the agenda, certainly the economic agenda specifically, is very, very different, right? It's much more conservative in a cultural sense, in a moral sense, sort of cultural moral values, and also it is largely to implement through top-down reforms, the neoliberal agenda, to revive ways to sustain and even strengthen neoliberal ideas. So in that sense, I think I have tried to apply more closely, more directly, kind of neo-fascist labels. But again, that's a conversation we're still trying to flesh out.
Good, thank you. Dóra, you're going to get the last word, and you might just focus on, vis-a-vis the question, what are the best remedies at this point for democratic erosion in Hungary?
So playing around with the labels, I think also going to give you an answer to this. So of course, this is also something that most of the political scientists are doing in Hungary, trying to figure out and giving a label to Orbán. But I would go for something, let's try a socially embedded autocrat, in a sense that there is real grassroots movement nurtured by the Catholic and other churches, which have been consistently and over several decades built up in various segments of the Hungarian society, which are absolute believers and supporters and sustainers of the Orbán regime. The Orbán regime itself does not necessarily has a very strong ideology. Nationalism and even racism or anti-Semitism just pops up and goes. It's not something that they necessarily nurture further than neoliberal ideas, depending on as long as they can remain in power. and do anything they want for that. So resistance then should come from a Gramscian conception of, recreate a different kind of social movement from the bottom up in order to, on the longer term, counter it, what Orbán has built up for himself. So that's mine.
Good. Okay, we're going to work with you on that Gramscian counter movement. Thanks, Rafael and Dóra, to you both. That was really fascinating set of comments from both of you on a wide range of issues from these two autocratizing countries. We're going to keep an eye on your elections and your political situations and call on you again to comment in the future. We're very grateful to have you here. Thank you very much. Thanks everybody for joining us.
Thank you.